The Mont Blanc pen slipped from Alexander Cross's fingers the moment she spoke. In the marble-walled private suite of the Peninsula Hotel, where billion-dollar deals were brokered over scotch that cost more than most people's monthly salary, a hotel clerk had just shattered everything. "Your Redstone acquisition will destroy 1,200 families by Christmas," Harper Donovan said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "But you already calculated that." The three executives froze, crystal glasses suspended mid-air. Alexander stared at the young woman in the simple navy uniform, her green eyes holding secrets that could topple empires. She wasn't supposed to understand the contracts spread across the mahogany table. She wasn't supposed to exist in their world at all. Yet here she stood, holding their fate in her steady hands, about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone dismisses. The Peninsula Hotel's penthouse suite glowed with the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted its price tag. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Chicago's skyline, where the evening lights twinkled like scattered diamonds against the October darkness. Alexander Cross adjusted his platinum cufflinks and poured himself 2 fingers of Macallan 25, the amber liquid catching the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. This was his domain, his world, where decisions worth more than small nations' GDP were made with the casual ease of ordering breakfast. Yet tonight, something felt different. Perhaps it was the way Evangeline Frost kept glancing at her phone, or how Mitchell Langford's usual swagger seemed forced, but Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that invisible currents were shifting beneath the surface of their carefully orchestrated meeting. "Comment where you're watching this from," he thought absently, wondering how many cities around the globe were hosting similar conversations at this very moment. The mahogany conference table bore the weight of documents that would reshape the American manufacturing landscape forever. Redstone Corporation's quarterly reports lay spread like battle plans, their margins bleeding red ink that told a story of decline and desperation. Mitchell Langford, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the late hour, gestured toward the projections with the confidence of a man who'd never missed a mortgage payment. "The numbers don't lie, Alexander. Redstone's bleeding cash, and their board knows it. They're ripe for acquisition, and your offer is the lifeline they need." His voice carried the smooth authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. Yet Alexander detected an undercurrent of urgency that hadn't been there 6 months ago. The deal would be worth $4.7 billion, a figure that represented not just corporate restructuring, but the livelihoods of thousands of workers scattered across Pennsylvania's Rust Belt towns. Evangeline Frost sat like a coiled serpent in her tailored Armani suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a style that suggested both elegance and efficiency. As the lead investment banker on the transaction, she commanded respect through sheer competence, her Harvard MBA and 15 years on Wall Street evident in every calculated gesture. "The due diligence is complete," she said, her manicured fingers dancing across her tablet's surface. "Redstone's assets are undervalued by at least 30%. Their manufacturing facilities are still solid, and their patents alone are worth the acquisition price. The synergies with Cross Industries are obvious." Her blue eyes fixed on Alexander with laser-like intensity, and he found himself wondering, not for the first time, why someone with her credentials had chosen to work with him rather than against him. The question lingered in the air like expensive perfume, beautiful but somehow unsettling. Alexander lifted his glass, savoring the whiskey's complex flavors while his mind calculated the human cost of their proposed efficiency measures. At 52, he'd built his empire by making hard decisions that others couldn't or wouldn't make, transforming struggling companies into profitable ventures through what business schools euphemistically called operational optimization. Yet lately, the faces of displaced workers had begun haunting his dreams. Their stories filtered through his daughter's increasingly pointed questions about corporate responsibility. "The timeline concerns me," he said finally, setting down his glass with deliberate precision. "Moving this fast always carries risks, and Redstone's workforce won't disappear quietly. We need to consider the optics." His words hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar, elegant but potentially toxic. The soft knock on the suite's door barely registered above the hum of central air conditioning, but Evangeline's head snapped up with predatory alertness. "Room service," came a quiet voice from beyond the heavy oak panels. Mitchell waved dismissively, his attention focused on the tablet displaying Redstone's organizational charts. "Just leave whatever it is outside. We're not to be disturbed." But the knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of a key card being inserted into the electronic lock. Alexander frowned. His security protocols were legendary throughout corporate Chicago, and unauthorized entries simply didn't happen in his world. The door opened to reveal a young woman in the peninsula's signature Navy uniform, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, and her hands steady as she wheeled in a cart laden with coffee service and late-night refreshments. Harper Donovan moved through the suite with the invisible efficiency that marked truly skilled hospitality workers, her presence so unobtrusive that the three executives continued their discussion as if she were part of the furniture. She'd perfected this art over 18 months of night shifts, learning to navigate the rarefied atmosphere of Chicago's power brokers while remaining essentially invisible to their consciousness. Yet her trained ears caught every nuance of their conversation, every casual reference to redundancies and streamlining operations that translated into real families losing their paychecks. Her father's construction company had employed 43 people before the 2008 financial crisis, and she remembered the hollow look in David Donovan's eyes as he'd signed the bankruptcy papers that ended 3 generations of family business. These men spoke of workers as line items on spreadsheets, but Harper knew the weight of every number. The coffee service completed, Harper began collecting the dinner plates with practiced efficiency, her movements economical and purposeful. She'd developed an ability to work while listening, a skill honed during countless nights serving Chicago's elite while they discussed deals that would reshape entire industries. Tonight's conversation felt different, heavier somehow, weighted with consequences that extended far beyond the hotel's marble walls. As she lifted Mitchell's barely touched salmon, her eyes caught the header on one of the documents: Redstone Manufacturing, Workforce Reduction Strategy. The numbers beneath told a story she knew all too well. 1,200 employees across 6 facilities, average age 47, average tenure 11 years. These weren't statistics, they were her neighbors, her community, the people who'd built America's industrial backbone with their own hands. "The beauty of the Redstone acquisition," Evangeline was saying, her voice carrying the cool precision of a surgeon discussing an operation, "lies in the immediate cost savings. By consolidating operations and eliminating redundant positions, we project 37% margin improvement within the first fiscal quarter." She scrolled through charts that reduced human lives to colored bars and trend lines, her expression remaining professionally neutral. Alexander nodded slowly, but Harper caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested internal conflict. Mitchell leaned forward eagerly, his gold wedding band catching the light as he gestured toward the projections. "Those savings translate directly to shareholder value, and the market will reward that kind of decisive action. We're talking about transforming a dying company into a lean, profitable machine." Harper's hands stilled on the coffee cup she'd been collecting, the delicate porcelain trembling slightly in her grip. The words, "dying company" and "lean machine," echoed in her mind, each syllable representing families who would receive pink slips before Christmas morning. She thought of the nursing home bills that consumed most of her paycheck, of the student loans that had followed her Harvard dreams into this hotel corridor, of the countless nights she'd spent serving people who discussed human suffering with the same detachment they might use to describe weather patterns. Something inside her chest tightened, a spring wound too tight, ready to snap. "Your Redstone acquisition will destroy 1,200 families by Christmas," she heard herself saying, the words emerging with startling clarity. "But you already calculated that." The Mont Blanc pen slipped from Alexander's fingers, clattering against the mahogany table with the sound of breaking glass. The 3 executives turned toward her with the synchronized precision of a firing squad, their faces displaying varying degrees of shock, irritation, and calculation. Mitchell's expression shifted from dismissive annoyance to predatory interest as he took in Harper's simple uniform and unimpressed demeanor. "I'm sorry, miss, "But this is a private meeting. Perhaps you didn't understand the 'do not disturb' instruction." His voice carried the patronizing tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. But Harper's green eyes held steady, unflinching under his stare. The air in the suite seemed to thicken, charged with the electricity that precedes a thunderstorm. And Alexander found himself leaning forward despite every instinct telling him to dismiss this interruption and return to the safety of numbers and projections. But beautiful. The Harvard Business School campus had been Harper's sanctuary once, its red brick buildings and ivy-covered walls promising a future that seemed as solid and enduring as the institution itself. She could still remember the weight of her acceptance letter, the way her father's calloused hands had trembled as he'd read the words that confirmed his daughter would be the first Donovan to earn a graduate degree. Those had been different times, when David Donovan's construction company was still solvent and the American dream felt achievable rather than cruel. Harper had thrown herself into her studies with the desperation of someone who understood that education represented escape, not just personal advancement. Her professors had recognized her talent immediately, the way she could dissect complex financial structures and propose elegant solutions that others missed entirely. The memory of her case competition victory still burned bright in her mind. The moment when she'd outlined a restructuring plan for a failing automotive supplier that preserved jobs while increasing profitability by 23%. The judges had been unanimous in their praise, calling her presentation brilliantly innovative and remarkably mature for someone her age. Standing at that podium, accepting congratulations from industry leaders who represented everything she aspired to become, Harper had felt invincible. The future stretched before her like an open highway, filled with corner offices and boardroom victories, and the kind of respect that money couldn't buy, but education could provide. She'd imagined calling her father with news of job offers from Goldman Sachs and McKinsey, watching his face light up with the pride that had sustained him through decades of physical labor. But dreams, Harper had learned, were fragile things, easily shattered by the brutal mathematics of economic reality. The call had come on a Tuesday morning in October, her father's voice hollow and distant as he'd explained about the subprime mortgage crisis, about credit lines being frozen, about clients who couldn't pay for completed work. David Donovan Construction had survived 3 recessions, 2 major lawsuits, and countless smaller setbacks. But it couldn't survive the systematic destruction of the American financial system. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he'd whispered into the phone, the words carrying the weight of a man watching his life's work crumble. "I know you were counting on me for tuition, but there's nothing left." The silence that followed had lasted only seconds, but it felt like watching a bridge collapse in slow motion, each falling beam representing another year of postponed dreams. The withdrawal from Harvard had been handled with bureaucratic efficiency that seemed almost cruel in its indifference. Forms signed, transcripts sealed, dormitory rooms emptied with the methodical precision that marked all institutional failures. Harper had packed her belongings while her classmates attended lectures on corporate strategy and international finance, subjects that suddenly seemed as distant as astronomy. The business card in her wallet still bore the Harvard seal, but the edges had worn soft from nervous handling, and the gold embossing had faded to the color of old brass. She'd kept it as a reminder of what might have been, though lately it felt more like evidence of a crime that had never been properly prosecuted. The Peninsula Hotel had hired her without question, their human resources department impressed by her obvious intelligence and equally obvious desperation. Night shifts paid a premium, and the clientele tended toward discretion rather than casual conversation, making it easier to maintain the professional distance that emotional survival required. Harper had discovered she possessed an unexpected talent for invisibility, moving through the hotel's corridors like a ghost in navy blue, present but unnoticed, essential but unacknowledged. The work itself was honest, requiring skills that her business education had never covered but which came naturally to someone raised by working-class parents who understood that dignity came from doing any job well. Alexander Cross's reputation preceded him into every room he entered, His name, synonymous with corporate turnarounds that generated massive returns for investors while leaving communities to count the human cost. Forbes had called him the architect of efficiency, a title that sounded heroic until you understood the blueprints he favored. Harper had researched him obsessively after her first encounter, reading quarterly reports and business journal profiles with the intensity of a detective studying a crime scene. What she'd found was a man of contradictions, ruthlessly effective yet privately philanthropic, publicly confident yet increasingly isolated, successful by every metric that mattered in corporate America yet somehow diminished by each victory. The background check that Alexander's security team conducted was thorough but revealed nothing that Harper hadn't expected them to find. Student loans that accumulated interest like cancer, employment records that told the story of someone overqualified for every position she'd held, and credit scores that reflected the financial precariousness of working-class life in modern America. What surprised her was the follow-up call from Alexander's assistant, requesting her presence for a private consultation at Cross Industries headquarters. The offer was generous enough to cover 3 months of her mother's nursing home expenses, but Harper understood that generosity in corporate America was always transactional, and she wondered what Alexander Cross thought he was purchasing. The nursing home in suburban Ohio where Claire Donovan resided represented both the best and worst of American elder care, a facility that provided excellent medical attention while systematically bankrupting the families it served. Harper's mother had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's 2 years earlier, the cruel irony being that her mind was disappearing just as her body remained stubbornly healthy. The disease had stolen Claire's memories of her daughter's Harvard acceptance, leaving behind only fragments of recognition and an increasing need for specialized care that insurance considered optional. Harper visited twice monthly, making the drive from Chicago in a used Honda that threatened mechanical failure with every mile, watching her mother fade incrementally while the bills arrived with clockwork precision. David Donovan had lasted exactly 18 months after losing his company, his heart giving out during a cold February morning while he'd been shoveling snow from their driveway. The coroner had cited cardiac arrest, but Harper knew better. Her father had died of broken dreams and accumulated disappointments, the weight of providing for his family finally exceeding his emotional capacity. The life insurance policy had covered funeral expenses and 1 semester of nursing home care, but Claire's condition required resources that existed only in the theoretical America, where hard work guaranteed security. Harper had learned to calculate her mother's remaining time in financial rather than medical terms, a mathematical exercise that felt like drowning in slow motion. The Harvard Alumni Network had reached out periodically, offering networking opportunities and career counseling services that assumed she possessed the luxury of choice. Harper responded to these communications with polite deflection, unwilling to explain that her Harvard credentials were essentially meaningless when survival required immediate income rather than long-term career development. She'd attended one alumni event, standing awkwardly in a hotel ballroom while her former classmates discussed IPOs and merger arbitrage, their easy confidence highlighting everything she'd lost when her father's phone call had redirected her life. The experience had taught her that privilege, once lost, was nearly impossible to reclaim, and that the American dream was less accessible than advertised. The Cross Industries tower pierced Chicago's skyline like a steel and glass exclamation point, its 97 floors housing the kind of corporate power that shaped global markets from climate-controlled boardrooms. Alexander's office occupied the entire 95th floor, its windows offering a view that reduced the city's 8 million residents to abstract patterns of light and movement. Harper stood at those windows now, watching the morning sun paint Lake Michigan in shades of silver and gold, while her mind processed the magnitude of what Alexander had requested. The meeting had been scheduled for 7 a.m., ensuring privacy while the building's other occupants slept or commuted, and Harper found herself wondering if this early hour represented consideration for her schedule or Alexander's preference for conducting sensitive business away from prying eyes. The restructuring plan that Harper had prepared during 3 sleepless nights represented everything she'd learned at Harvard distilled into 47 pages of analysis and recommendations. Unlike the Redstone acquisition documents she'd glimpsed in the hotel suite, Her proposal treated workers as assets rather than liabilities, recognizing that industrial knowledge and manufacturing expertise couldn't be easily replaced or outsourced. The fundamental flaw in conventional acquisition strategy, she explained, her voice gaining confidence as she warmed to her subject, is the assumption that cost-cutting equals value creation. But Redstone's workers represent decades of accumulated expertise that competitors would pay millions to acquire. Alexander listened with the intensity of someone accustomed to briefings from McKinsey consultants and Wharton professors. Yet Harper's perspective felt entirely fresh, untainted by the groupthink that dominated corporate America. The automation partnership that Harper proposed would transform Redstone's manufacturing processes while preserving employment through retraining and skill development programs. Rather than viewing technology as a replacement for human labor, her plan positioned it as an enhancement that could make American manufacturing competitive with overseas production. Automated systems require skilled technicians for maintenance and optimization, Harper continued, her finger tracing production flowcharts that told a story of renaissance rather than decline. Instead of eliminating jobs, we're upgrading them, creating positions that pay better while producing higher quality output. The numbers were compelling. A 28% increase in productivity combined with a 15% reduction in defect rates, all while maintaining full employment and actually increasing average wages. Alexander found himself studying Harper's face as much as her presentation, searching for signs of naivety or inexperience that might explain her optimistic projections. Instead, he saw the kind of analytical rigor that he'd built his career upon, combined with an emotional intelligence that seemed increasingly rare in corporate America. The political benefits alone justify the approach, Harper was saying, her green eyes animated with the passion of someone who discovered their true calling. Imagine the press coverage when Cross Industries becomes the first major corporation to acquire a struggling manufacturer and increase rather than decrease employment. The goodwill generated would be worth millions in marketing value. Her argument was sound, but Alexander sensed deeper motivations beneath the surface. Personal stakes that gave her advocacy an urgency that pure business logic couldn't provide. The private files that Alexander revealed represented years of accumulated guilt and growing unease about the human cost of his success. Redstone's environmental violations had been carefully documented by his investigation team, each incident representing shortcuts taken to maximize quarterly profits at the expense of long-term sustainability. They've been dumping coal ash into groundwater for 15 years, Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many such reports. The EPA knows, but Redstone's lobbying budget keeps the fines manageable and the cleanup voluntary. Harper's expression hardened as she read through incident reports that described contamination levels that would have triggered federal intervention if the affected communities had possessed political influence rather than just political representatives. The Pennsylvania coal country that Harper's father had once served with his construction company bore the scars of decades of environmental negligence, its streams running orange with acid runoff and its residents suffering from respiratory ailments that were rarely connected to their industrial neighbors. David Donovan had bid on several Redstone remediation projects over the years, his proposals always undercut by competitors willing to use substandard materials and inadequate containment systems. My father tried to do these cleanups properly, Harper said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. He lost contracts because he wouldn't cut corners on environmental protection. The companies that got those contracts are the reason Redstone's violations continued. Alexander recognized the personal dimension that drove Harper's advocacy, understanding that her proposals represented both business strategy and moral imperative. The knock on Alexander's office door came without warning. Evangeline Frost's entrance as smooth and predatory as a shark gliding through dark water. Her tailored Chanel suit suggested both authority and accessibility, the kind of carefully calculated image that opened doors throughout corporate America while revealing nothing of substance about the person wearing it. Alexander, I hope you don't mind the interruption, she said, her smile perfectly calibrated to suggest warmth while her eyes remained calculatingly cold. Mitchell mentioned you were reviewing the Redstone materials privately, and I wanted to ensure you had access to the complete financial picture. Harper felt the temperature in the room drop perceptibly, sensing undercurrents of tension that had nothing to do with business strategy and everything to do with power dynamics she didn't yet understand. Evangeline's reaction to Harper's presence was subtle but unmistakable. A momentary tightening around her eyes that suggested recognition followed immediately by calculation. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," she said, extending a manicured hand toward Harper with the smooth professionalism of someone accustomed to networking events and corporate receptions. "Evangeline Frost, Managing Director at Sterling Capital Partners." Harper accepted the handshake, noting the firmness that spoke of confidence and the slight moisture that suggested nervousness despite the controlled exterior. Something about the interaction felt performative, as if Evangeline were playing a role rather than engaging naturally, and Harper filed the observation away for future consideration. The financial modeling that Harper had prepared represented hours of work with outdated software on her personal laptop, but the analysis rivaled anything that Evangeline's team at Sterling Capital had produced. As Harper walked through her projections, explaining how job retention could actually improve rather than impair profitability, Evangeline's professional mask began to slip slightly. "These assumptions about worker productivity seem overly optimistic," Evangeline interjected, her tone carrying the dismissive authority of someone accustomed to having her expertise accepted without question. "American manufacturing workers simply can't compete with overseas labor costs, regardless of training programs or technological upgrades." Harper met her gaze directly, recognizing the challenge for what it was, an attempt to reassert professional hierarchy through intellectual intimidation. Alexander watched the exchange with growing fascination, recognizing in Harper the kind of innovative thinking that had built his empire while sensing in Evangeline a defensiveness that seemed disproportionate to the situation. The tension between the two women felt electric, charged with competitive energy that extended beyond simple disagreement about business strategy. Harper's analysis assumes worker engagement and skill development that we rarely see in practice, Evangeline continued, her voice maintaining its professional tone, while her body language suggested barely controlled irritation. "The human element is too unpredictable for the kind of precision that serious investors require." The words carried an implicit dismissal of Harper's credentials and experience. Yet Alexander found himself more convinced by Harper's passion than by Evangeline's polish. The meeting concluded with polite exchanges and professional promises to review all options thoroughly, but Harper sensed that something fundamental had shifted in the room's dynamics. Evangeline's departure was as smooth as her arrival, leaving behind only the faintest trace of expensive perfume and an atmosphere thick with unspoken implications. Alexander walked Harper to his private elevator, their conversation casual but their silence pregnant with possibility. "Your analysis is impressive," he said finally, his voice carrying genuine respect rather than patronizing encouragement. "I'd like you to prepare a more detailed implementation timeline, something we can present to Redstone's board as a serious alternative to conventional restructuring." The assignment represented both opportunity and risk, Harper realized. A chance to prove herself while potentially making enemies of people who possessed the power to destroy her fragile financial stability. As the elevator descended toward street level, Harper caught her reflection in the polished steel doors and saw someone she barely recognized. A Harvard-trained analyst whose ideas might actually matter, rather than a hotel clerk whose opinions were systematically ignored. The transformation felt both exhilarating and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff while deciding whether the distance to the other side was achievable or suicidal. The phone call that Evangeline made from her car in the parking garage went unnoticed by Harper, but its implications would soon become impossible to ignore. "We have a problem," Evangeline's voice carried clearly through her Bluetooth system as she navigated Chicago's morning traffic. "She's David Donovan's daughter, and she knows too much." The response was brief but definitive, and Evangeline's smile as she ended the call suggested that Harper's moment of opportunity might be shorter than she'd imagined. The Chicago Public Library's business archives occupied 3 floors of climate-controlled precision, housing decades of financial records and corporate documents that told the unvarnished story of American capitalism. Harper spent her days off here, surrounded by the particular silence that comes from information sleeping in perfect rows, waiting for someone with the right questions to wake it up. She'd learned to navigate these archives during her Harvard years, developing a researcher's instincts for finding connections that others missed or chose to ignore. Today's investigation felt different, personal in a way that made her hands tremble slightly as she requested files from the circulation desk. The librarian, a woman whose gray hair and patient demeanor suggested decades of academic service, handed over the boxes containing Sterling Capital Partners' regulatory filings from 2008 with the neutral efficiency that institutional knowledge required. Evangeline Frost's name appeared throughout the documents like a thread connecting disasters, her signature authorizing transactions that had devastated working-class communities across the industrial Midwest. As a junior analyst, she'd specialized in distressed asset acquisition, identifying struggling companies whose failures could be accelerated through strategic credit pressure and targeted market manipulation. The strategy was legal, technically sophisticated, and morally bankrupt, designed to create opportunities for investors while destroying the accumulated wealth of entire communities. Harper found herself studying Evangeline's employee photograph from that era, noting the same calculating intelligence in her eyes but a younger face unmarked by the subtle hardening that success in predatory finance inevitably produced. David Donovan Construction appeared in Sterling Capital's files as case study number 47. A small company whose destruction had been so routine that it merited only 3 pages of documentation. Harper read those pages with the detached fascination of someone examining their own autopsy report, each line item representing a memory from her father's final months. The credit line freeze had been coordinated with 2 other regional lenders, creating a liquidity crisis that forced immediate bankruptcy despite the company's underlying profitability. Evangeline's notes were clinical in their precision. Target Company maintained strong relationships with local workforce and municipal authorities. Acquisition of assets recommended within 60 days to prevent potential labor organization or political intervention. The language was bloodless, but Harper could translate its meaning into human terms, destroy them quickly before they can defend themselves. The land acquisition that followed David Donovan Construction's bankruptcy had netted Sterling Capital Partners a 400% return on investment within 18 months. The company's workshop, offices, and equipment yard had been sold to a development group that transformed the property into luxury condominiums marketed to Chicago commuters seeking small-town charm at urban prices. Harper's childhood home had been demolished to make room for a fitness center and community pool, its foundation filled with concrete that sealed away 3 generations of family history. The irony was perfect. Her father's life's work had become recreational space for the kind of people who'd never touched a tool or worried about making payroll. The connection between Evangeline's 2008 activities and the current Redstone acquisition felt obvious once Harper understood the pattern, but proving it required documentation that existed in the gray areas between public records and private communications. She spent hours cross-referencing SEC filings with bankruptcy court documents, building a timeline that showed how Evangeline's early career had prepared her for increasingly sophisticated forms of financial manipulation. The Redstone deal represented the culmination of 15 years of experience in corporate destruction, but this time, the stakes were exponentially higher. Instead of destroying a 43-person construction company, Evangeline was orchestrating the elimination of 1,200 manufacturing jobs. Their accumulated expertise scattered to the economic winds while the underlying assets were stripped and sold. Harper's investigation revealed that Redstone's current financial crisis had been artificially accelerated through the same techniques that Sterling Capital had perfected during the financial crisis. Key suppliers had been encouraged to demand immediate payment for outstanding invoices, creating cash flow problems that legitimate restructuring could have avoided. Credit lines had been subtly undermined through coordinated pressure from multiple lenders, each acting independently but with suspiciously synchronized timing. The methodology was signature Evangeline Frost, Harper realized. Recognizing the same systematic approach that had destroyed her father's company, but executed with the confidence that came from years of successful practice. The environmental violations that Alexander had shared represented only the visible portion of a much larger scandal, Harper discovered, as she dug deeper into Redstone's regulatory history. Evangeline's team had documented these violations thoroughly, not for remediation but for leverage, creating a comprehensive blackmail file that could destroy the company's remaining reputation if deployed strategically. The EPA investigations had been delayed through legal maneuvering that bore Evangeline's fingerprints, keeping the violations classified as pending rather than actionable. The strategy was elegant in its cruelty. Use environmental crimes as justification for acquisition while ensuring that cleanup costs would be borne by taxpayers rather than the acquiring corporation. Mitchell Langford's role in the conspiracy became clearer as Harper traced communication patterns between Redstone's executive team and Sterling Capital's analysts. His eagerness to sell the company wasn't driven by market conditions but by personal financial pressures that Evangeline had helped create. A series of bad investments, encouraged by Sterling Capital's research department, had left Mitchell personally leveraged beyond his ability to service debt. The Redstone sale would generate enough commission to save his personal finances while destroying the company he'd supposedly been hired to protect. Harper recognized the technique: create personal dependency, then exploit it to achieve corporate objectives. The threatening message that appeared in Harper's hotel locker was brief but unmistakably clear. "Stop digging or join your father." The note was typed rather than handwritten, printed on generic office paper that provided no forensic evidence of its origin. But Harper didn't need forensic analysis to understand its meaning or identify its probable source. Evangeline Frost had built her career by destroying people who threatened her interests, and Harper's investigation represented exactly the kind of threat that required decisive action. The reference to her father's death was particularly chilling, suggesting knowledge of Harper's personal history that could only come from thorough background research. Harper photographed the note with her phone before sealing it in a plastic evidence bag that she'd purchased from an office supply store. Her hands shook slightly as she performed these tasks, adrenaline mixing with fear to create a cocktail of emotions that she hadn't experienced since her father's funeral. The rational part of her mind suggested involving law enforcement, but Harper understood that threatening notes were meaningless without proof of criminal intent, and proving intent required evidence that would put her in even greater danger. Instead, she began creating backup copies of all her research, storing digital files in multiple cloud accounts, while maintaining physical copies in her apartment and safety deposit box. The phone call to her mother's nursing home was routine, but Harper found herself listening more carefully than usual for any signs of unusual activity or suspicious visitors. Claire Donovan's condition remained stable, the night supervisor reported, though she'd been asking for someone named David more frequently than usual. The name belonged to Harper's father, but Claire's damaged memory couldn't retain the information that he'd been dead for 3 years. Harper ended the call with instructions to contact her immediately if anyone unfamiliar requested information about Claire's condition or attempted to visit without authorization. The precautions felt both necessary and paranoid, but Harper had learned that the difference between caution and paranoia was often determined only in retrospect. Alexander's text message arrived as Harper was leaving the library, its timing suggesting surveillance that made her scan the street for watchers she probably wouldn't recognize. "Need to discuss your findings urgently. Private location, tomorrow morning." The message was followed by an address in Lincoln Park, a neighborhood where privacy came with the kind of price tag that made casual surveillance financially impractical. Harper replied with simple confirmation, understanding that whatever conversation awaited her would determine whether her investigation continued or whether she joined the growing list of people who'd underestimated Evangeline Frost's willingness to protect her interests through any means necessary. The maintenance request appeared legitimate enough, processed through the Peninsula Hotel's standard work order system with all the appropriate authorization codes and scheduling confirmations. Harper's apartment building received similar service calls monthly, part of the management company's efforts to maintain the aging infrastructure that housed Chicago's service economy workers in varying degrees of comfort and despair. The supervisor who appeared at Harper's door carried credentials from Midwest Property Services, a company whose online presence suggested competence without inspiring particular confidence or suspicion. Harper was at work when the visit occurred, her neighbor Mrs. Chen noting only that the maintenance had been quieter and more efficient than usual, lasting exactly 47 minutes according to her precise record-keeping. Evangeline's coordination of the evidence planting required the kind of logistical precision that had made her reputation on Wall Street, each element timed and executed with the mechanical efficiency that complex financial fraud demanded. The stolen documents were genuine Redstone financial records, obtained through Sterling Capital's legitimate access, but photocopied onto paper that bore Harper's fingerprints from her hotel work. The placement in Harper's apartment locker was artful, hidden well enough to suggest guilty concealment, but discoverable enough to ensure that a thorough FBI search would find them. The digital trail that would lead investigators to the documents had been carefully constructed over several weeks, creating a pattern of suspicious online activity that appeared to originate from Harper's IP address. The corrupt FBI contact who received Evangeline's tip represented 15 years of careful relationship building, a senior agent whose gambling debts and divorce payments had made him amenable to occasional favors that bent but didn't technically break federal law. Agent Morris had built his career on financial crime investigations, developing expertise in corporate espionage cases that made him the perfect conduit for information about suspicious hotel employees with access to sensitive business documents. The initial report described Harper as a person of interest in potential intellectual property theft, someone whose financial desperation and educational background made her a logical candidate for corporate espionage activities. Alexander's growing suspicions about Evangeline reflected years of business instincts honed through countless negotiations where reading people correctly meant the difference between profit and catastrophic loss. Her behavior during recent meetings had been subtly wrong, like a musical performance played in perfect pitch but slightly off-tempo. The background verification that his security team conducted revealed discrepancies in her employment history that seemed minor individually but collectively suggested a pattern of deception. Evangeline's Harvard MBA credentials were legitimate, but several early career positions had been embellished in ways that enhanced her narrative while obscuring potentially embarrassing details. The timeline inconsistencies that troubled Alexander most involved Evangeline's knowledge of Redstone's internal financial problems, information that she'd possessed before Sterling Capital's official due diligence began. Her presentation materials referenced quarterly projections that Redstone hadn't shared with potential acquirers, suggesting access to confidential information through channels that she hadn't disclosed. When Alexander questioned her directly about these sources, Evangeline's explanations were plausible but felt rehearsed, like answers to questions she'd anticipated rather than spontaneous responses to genuine curiosity. Harper's documentation of her investigation had expanded beyond simple research into something approaching a federal case file, complete with timeline charts and network analyses that would have impressed her Harvard professors. She worked on these materials during her hotel shifts, using quiet moments between service calls to update spreadsheets and cross-reference public records. The threat she'd received made secrecy essential, but the evidence she'd assembled was too important to keep entirely private. Her solution was elegant: create multiple copies with different recipients, ensuring that her research would survive even if she didn't. The FBI raid schedule that Evangeline's contact provided was precise enough to ensure success while maintaining the appearance of routine investigation procedures. Harper's work schedule placed her at the hotel during the planned search time, providing an alibi that would protect her from immediate arrest while ensuring that incriminating evidence would be discovered in her absence. The warrant application described probable cause based on suspicious financial transactions and anonymous tips about stolen corporate documents, creating a legal foundation that would withstand judicial scrutiny while serving Evangeline's objectives perfectly. Mitchell Langford's impatience with the acquisition timeline reflected personal financial pressures that were approaching critical mass, his creditors beginning to question guarantees that depended on the Redstone sale proceeding as scheduled. Phone calls with his accountant revealed a cash flow crisis that would become public knowledge within weeks unless the acquisition generated enough personal income to service his accumulated debts. Evangeline had encouraged many of the investments that created Mitchell's current problems, positioning herself as both the cause of his crisis and its potential solution through calculated manipulation that would have impressed Machiavelli. The acceleration of Evangeline's timeline reflected a strategic gamble that weighed the risks of moving too quickly against the dangers of allowing Harper's investigation to continue unchecked. Corporate espionage charges typically resulted in plea agreements that included non-disclosure clauses, effectively silencing targets while avoiding the public scrutiny that criminal trials would generate. Harper's imprisonment would eliminate her as a threat while sending a clear message to anyone else who might consider investigating Sterling Capital's business practices. Harper's discovery of surveillance equipment in the hotel's employee break room confirmed her worst suspicions about the scope of the conspiracy she'd uncovered. The listening devices were sophisticated but not invisible, hidden with the kind of professional competence that suggested law enforcement resources rather than private security capabilities. The placement was strategic, positioned to monitor conversations between staff members who might possess information about guest activities or hotel security procedures. Harper's realization that her workplace had been compromised created an immediate operational problem: how to continue her investigation while avoiding detection by people who were monitoring her every conversation. The burner phone that Harper purchased from a convenience store in Chinatown represented a technological step backwards that modern surveillance hadn't anticipated, its analog simplicity providing security that encrypted smartphones couldn't match. Her call to Alexander was brief and coded, suggesting a meeting location that would be difficult to monitor while avoiding specific references to their investigation. The Lincoln Park Zoo's penguin exhibit provided both public access and acoustic cover, the sound of water and children's voices making electronic surveillance challenging while creating plausible justification for any meeting that might be observed. Alexander's decision to help Harper represented a moral choice that surprised him with its clarity, cutting through years of ethical compromises and calculated amorality to reveal principles he'd thought were permanently buried. The business case for supporting Harper was weak. The personal case was overwhelming. Evangeline's willingness to frame an innocent woman revealed a sociopathic dimension that Alexander had somehow missed despite years of collaboration. The realization that he'd been working with someone capable of such calculated cruelty forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about his own complicity in systems that routinely destroyed innocent people for profit. The 12-hour countdown that began with Evangeline's final preparations created urgency that compressed decision-making into instinctive responses rather than calculated strategies. Harper and Alexander would need to move quickly, gathering evidence while avoiding the surveillance network that Evangeline had carefully constructed around them. The stakes couldn't be higher. Failure would mean Harper's imprisonment and the successful completion of a financial crime that would destroy 1,200 families while generating hundreds of millions in profits for the conspirators. Success would require outmaneuvering sophisticated opponents with access to law enforcement resources and unlimited financial backing, using only their intelligence and determination against institutional corruption that had been years in the making. The pre-dawn darkness of Chicago's streets provided cover that Harper needed as she slipped away from her apartment building through the basement parking garage, avoiding the main entrance where FBI surveillance teams had likely already established positions. Her escape route had been planned during sleepless nights when paranoia and preparation merged into practical precautions that might mean the difference between freedom and federal prison. The prepaid phone buzzed against her hip as she navigated alleys that connected her neighborhood to the loop, its anonymous number providing the only communication link to Alexander that hadn't been compromised by Evangeline's surveillance network. The message was brief but clear. Lincoln Park Zoo, penguin exhibit, 20 minutes. Harper's breath formed clouds in the October cold as she quickened her pace, understanding that timing would be everything in the confrontation that awaited. Alexander's private office at Cross Industries Tower had become a war room by the time Harper arrived, its walls covered with printouts and timeline charts that transformed Evangeline's conspiracy into a visual narrative that even federal prosecutors couldn't ignore. The security measures that protected the building during business hours created perfect isolation for their clandestine meeting. Elevator access codes ensuring that their conversation would remain private while city lights through floor-to-ceiling windows reminded them of the millions of people whose lives would be affected by the decisions made in this room. Harper spread her research across the conference table with the methodical precision of someone who understood that details mattered more than drama when building a case that would survive legal scrutiny. The confrontation between Alexander and Evangeline occurred in Cross Industries' main boardroom, a space designed to intimidate opponents and celebrate victories through architectural grandeur that emphasized power and permanence. Evangeline entered with her usual confidence, expecting routine discussion about acquisition timelines and regulatory approvals, but her composure shattered when she saw Harper's research materials displayed on wall-mounted monitors. "You've been busy," Alexander said, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone who'd built an empire by recognizing threats before they became fatal. "I'm particularly interested in your connection to David Donovan's bankruptcy, since you failed to mention that conflict of interest during our negotiations." The silence that followed felt heavy with implications, charged with the electricity that precedes corporate warfare. Evangeline's revelation of her criminal network exceeded even Harper's darkest suspicions. Describing a 15-year career built on systematic destruction of American manufacturing communities through techniques that were legal, sophisticated, and morally bankrupting to everyone involved, except the perpetrators. The Redstone acquisition represented the culmination of her career, a transaction large enough to establish her as a major force in corporate restructuring while generating enough profit to fund further expansion of her activities. "You think you understand business," she told Alexander, her professional mask finally slipping to reveal the predatory intelligence beneath. "But you've never had the stomach for what real success requires. You're still pretending that capitalism can be ethical, when every dollar you've made came from someone else's loss." The blackmail material that Evangeline displayed on her tablet represented years of research into Alexander's business practices, documenting tax avoidance strategies and regulatory violations that would destroy his reputation while generating criminal liability that could result in decades of federal imprisonment. Each image was perfectly composed, each document strategically chosen for maximum impact, creating a comprehensive file that demonstrated Evangeline's patience and attention to detail. "Your choice is simple," she continued, her voice regaining its professional polish as she outlined the terms of Alexander's capitulation. "Complete the Redstone acquisition as planned, or watch your empire collapse under federal investigation while your daughter reads about your crimes in the Wall Street Journal." Harper's infiltration of Redstone's Pittsburgh offices required skills that her hotel work had developed, but her Harvard education had never covered. Moving through industrial corridors with the invisible confidence that service workers used to navigate spaces where their presence was essential, but their acknowledgement was unwelcome. The security systems were sophisticated but predictable, designed to prevent external intrusion rather than internal investigation, creating vulnerabilities that someone with Harper's access and determination could exploit. The environmental reports she sought were stored in physical files rather than digital systems, reflecting corporate paranoia about electronic surveillance while creating opportunities for old-fashioned burglary that modern security hadn't anticipated. The coal ash contamination that Harper's father had tried to expose represented decades of environmental crimes that affected entire watersheds, poisoning groundwater that supplied hundreds of thousands of people with drinking water that met federal standards only because those standards had been systematically corrupted through lobbying efforts that Evangeline's network had helped coordinate. The original EPA reports detailed contamination levels that would have triggered immediate federal intervention, but subsequent revisions had reclassified the violations as procedural rather than substantive, creating legal cover for continued operations while ensuring that cleanup costs would be minimized rather than comprehensive. The private security response to Harper's presence in the Redstone facility was swift and professional. Trained personnel who understood that corporate espionage required immediate containment rather than criminal prosecution that might generate unwanted publicity. Harper's escape through the industrial complex drew upon childhood memories of playing in similar facilities when her father's construction crews had worked on maintenance projects, her familiarity with industrial architecture providing advantages that her pursuers couldn't match. The chase sequence through catwalks and machinery spaces felt cinematic but deadly serious, each wrong turn potentially leading to capture and charges that would end her investigation permanently. Alexander's decision to assist Harper's escape represented a fundamental shift in his worldview. The moment when theoretical principles became practical commitments that required personal risk rather than comfortable philanthropy. His network of contacts included security professionals whose loyalty was personal rather than financial. Former military personnel who understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of their outcome. The rescue operation was coordinated with military precision, using corporate resources to defeat corporate corruption in a way that would have amused Harper's father if he'd lived to see it. The evidence compilation that Harper and Alexander completed during their night-long session in his secure estate created a comprehensive case file that connected environmental crimes, financial fraud, and corporate conspiracy through documentation that federal prosecutors couldn't ignore or dismiss. Each piece of evidence was cross-referenced and verified, creating multiple chains of proof that would survive legal challenges while providing enough detail to support criminal charges against every participant in Evangeline's network. The work was exhausting but exhilarating. The feeling of using her Harvard education for justice rather than profit providing Harper with satisfaction that her abandoned MBA studies had never delivered. The federal prosecutors who received Harper and Alexander's evidence package were initially skeptical, their experience teaching them that corporate whistleblowers typically offered incomplete information motivated by personal grievances rather than public interest. But the quality of documentation and the scope of criminal activity described in Harper's materials demanded serious investigation, particularly the environmental violations that affected politically sensitive constituencies across multiple states. The timing was perfect. A new administration seeking high-profile environmental prosecutions while demonstrating commitment to corporate accountability that previous governments had avoided. Mitchell Langford's panic as the investigation expanded beyond Redstone's acquisition reflected the vulnerability of co-conspirators who lacked Evangeline's sophistication and resources, small-time criminals who'd been manipulated into participating in schemes whose full implications they'd never understood. His cooperation with federal investigators was immediate and comprehensive, providing inside information about Sterling Capital's methods while confirming details that Harper's research had suggested but couldn't prove. The domino effect of his confession created legal jeopardy for dozens of participants in the conspiracy, each facing federal charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. The warehouse confrontation that concluded Evangeline's criminal career occurred in an abandoned steel mill in Gary, Indiana, a location that symbolized everything her career had helped destroy while providing perfect acoustics for the kind of dramatic revelations that concluded complex financial thrillers. Evangeline's attempt to destroy evidence was methodical and professional, using thermite charges that would reduce paper documents to ash while eliminating digital storage devices through electromagnetic pulses that made data recovery impossible. But her escape plan had been compromised by Mitchell's cooperation with federal investigators, creating a trap that closed around her with the inevitability of justice finally served. Harper's final triumph over Evangeline wasn't physical, but intellectual, using supply chain analysis to prove that Evangeline's own financial transactions created paper trails that connected her to every aspect of the conspiracy she'd attempted to conceal. The logic was elegant and inescapable. Someone with Evangeline's sophistication would have covered her tracks perfectly, but the very perfection of those efforts created patterns that revealed their artificial nature. "You're too smart for your own good," Harper told her as FBI agents took her into custody, the words carrying personal satisfaction that years of powerlessness had made particularly sweet. Alexander's private estate in Lake Forest provided the perfect sanctuary for the kind of intensive collaboration that building a federal case required. Its fortified privacy and technological resources creating a secure environment where Harper could work without fear of surveillance or interruption. The mansion's library had been converted into a command center, its oak-paneled walls lined with monitors displaying evidence timelines and network analyses that transformed Evangeline's conspiracy into a visual narrative that even skeptical prosecutors couldn't dismiss. Harper found herself working 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and righteous anger, assembling the kind of comprehensive case file that could survive the legal challenges that wealthy criminals inevitably mounted against federal prosecution. The investigative journalist from the Chicago Tribune who joined their effort brought 20 years of experience exposing corporate corruption, his Pulitzer Prize credentials providing credibility that would be essential when their story reached public attention. James Morrison's reputation for meticulous fact-checking and fearless reporting made him the perfect conduit for information that needed to reach the public while maintaining the legal integrity that criminal prosecution required. His initial skepticism about Harper's claims dissolved quickly as he reviewed the documentation, his experienced eye recognizing the authentic patterns of corporate malfeasance that couldn't be fabricated or exaggerated. The federal environmental prosecutors who received their evidence package had been building cases against industrial polluters for years, their frustration with regulatory capture and corporate immunity making them eager allies in any investigation that promised real accountability for environmental crimes. Harper's documentation of coal ash contamination connected to Redstone's operations provided the missing links in multiple ongoing investigations, creating opportunities for comprehensive prosecution that could result in prison sentences rather than meaningless fines. The scope of environmental damage that Evangeline's network had enabled was staggering. Contaminated watersheds serving 3 states, air pollution affecting millions of residents, and systematic cover-ups that had prevented remediation for decades. The kidnapping of Claire Donovan from her Ohio nursing home represented Evangeline's most desperate gambit, a criminal escalation that demonstrated how thoroughly Harper's investigation had undermined her carefully constructed defenses. The fake medical transport that removed Claire from supervised care was sophisticated and professional, involving forged documentation and stolen ambulance equipment that suggested access to resources that criminal organizations typically couldn't acquire. Harper received the ransom demand through an encrypted message that outlined terms with brutal clarity. Surrender all evidence and cease all cooperation with law enforcement, or watch her mother suffer consequences that were described in medical detail that made Claire's vulnerabilities terrifyingly clear. Alexander's network of private investigators represented decades of relationship building with former law enforcement professionals whose loyalty was personal rather than institutional. Men and women who understood that some battles required working outside official channels to achieve justice that bureaucracy couldn't deliver. The search for Claire's location used techniques that federal agencies couldn't legally employ. Electronic surveillance and financial tracking that bypassed constitutional protections through private sector capabilities that existed in legal gray areas. The operation was expensive and technically challenging, requiring coordination between multiple teams across several states while maintaining operational security that prevented Evangeline from detecting their efforts. The abandoned steel mill in Gary, Indiana, where Evangeline had chosen to make her final stand, represented everything that her career had helped destroy. American industrial capacity sacrificed to global market forces that prioritized short-term profits over long-term community stability. The facility's vast machinery spaces and catwalks provided perfect acoustics for dramatic confrontations while offering multiple escape routes that demonstrated Evangeline's operational sophistication. Her choice of location was symbolic rather than practical, a theatrical gesture that revealed the narcissistic personality beneath her professional competence. Harper's confrontation with Evangeline in the mill's main assembly hall felt like a convergence of personal history and national tragedy. The site where American manufacturing had thrived now serving as the backdrop for crimes that had accelerated its decline. Evangeline had prepared for this moment carefully, arranging evidence for systematic destruction while maintaining security positions that should have prevented interference. But her operational planning hadn't accounted for Harper's intimate familiarity with industrial facilities, knowledge acquired during childhood visits to her father's construction sites that provided tactical advantages no amount of professional training could replace. The evidence destruction that Evangeline attempted would have been comprehensive if successful. Thermite charges capable of reducing paper documents to ash, while electromagnetic pulses eliminated digital storage devices beyond any possibility of recovery. Her methodical approach to destroying evidence demonstrated the same attention to detail that had made her successful in legitimate business, each step planned and executed with professional precision. But the industrial setting that she'd chosen for its symbolic value also provided Harper with resources that pure office environments couldn't offer. Water systems for fire suppression, electrical infrastructure for powering improvised communication devices, and structural knowledge that turned the facility itself into a strategic advantage. Claire Donovan's rescue occurred simultaneously with the evidence preservation effort, Alexander's security team locating her in a medical facility whose legitimate purposes provided perfect cover for temporary imprisonment of an elderly woman whose condition made her cooperation unnecessary, and whose disappearance could be explained as natural deterioration rather than criminal kidnapping. The timing was crucial. Federal agents needed to secure both Claire's safety and the evidence against Evangeline before either could be eliminated through violence that would destroy Harper's case while silencing the only witnesses to decades of financial crime. The supply chain analysis that Harper used to defeat Evangeline's final deceptions drew upon knowledge that business schools taught as theoretical frameworks, but which Harper understood as practical tools for exposing corporate criminality. Evangeline's financial transactions, no matter how carefully structured, created patterns that revealed their artificial nature when subjected to the kind of systematic analysis that Harper's Harvard education had prepared her to conduct. The beauty of the solution was its simplicity. Criminals who were smart enough to avoid obvious mistakes were often too smart for their own good, creating complex systems that drew attention through their very sophistication. Federal agents surrounding the steel mill represented months of coordination between multiple agencies whose jurisdictional conflicts had been resolved through pressure from prosecutorial offices seeking high-profile environmental convictions that would demonstrate government commitment to corporate accountability. The arrest warrant for Evangeline included charges spanning 15 years of criminal activity, from financial fraud and environmental violations to kidnapping and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Each count carried potential sentences that would ensure Evangeline spent the remainder of her life in federal prison, regardless of the legal resources that wealthy defendants typically use to minimize their punishment. The moment of Evangeline's defeat came not through physical confrontation but through intellectual triumph. Harper's explanation of the evidence against her delivered with the calm authority of someone who'd spent months preparing for this conversation. "You made one fundamental mistake," Harper told her as FBI agents moved into position throughout the facility. "You assumed that destroying evidence would protect you, but the very pattern of destruction proves your guilt. Only someone with complete knowledge of the conspiracy would know exactly which documents needed to be eliminated, and your target list is a perfect roadmap of your crimes." The logic was inescapable, and Evangeline's recognition of her defeat was visible in the way her shoulders sagged as handcuffs replaced her executive authority. Mitchell Langford's cooperation with federal investigators accelerated as news of Evangeline's arrest reached him, his willingness to provide testimony growing exponentially as he understood the scope of criminal liability that faced all participants in the conspiracy. His detailed knowledge of Redstone's internal operations proved invaluable for prosecutors building cases that could withstand the aggressive defense strategies that white-collar criminals typically employed. The plea agreement that he negotiated included substantial cooperation requirements and asset forfeiture provisions that would ensure he emerged from federal prison as financially destroyed as the communities that his crimes had affected. The media coverage that followed Evangeline's arrest transformed Harper from invisible hotel worker into national symbol of individual courage, challenging institutional corruption, though she remained uncomfortable with attention that felt inconsistent with her practical nature and Midwestern sensibilities. Interview requests from major news organizations were declined politely but firmly, Harper preferring that the focus remain on systematic reforms rather than personal narratives that might distract from broader issues of corporate accountability. Her father's legacy was better served through policy changes than personality profiles, she believed, and justice was more important than celebrity. The environmental remediation that federal courts ordered as part of Evangeline's sentence represented the largest corporate environmental cleanup in American history. Billions of dollars directed toward restoration of watersheds and communities that had been systematically poisoned through decades of regulatory negligence. The funding came from asset forfeiture provisions that stripped Evangeline and her co-conspirators of wealth accumulated through environmental crimes, creating poetic justice that satisfied both practical and philosophical requirements for meaningful punishment. Harper's role in designing the remediation programs ensured that affected communities received resources for long-term recovery rather than superficial repairs that would satisfy legal requirements while failing to address underlying damage. Alexander's transformation through the investigation process surprised everyone, including himself, revealing principles that years of corporate success had buried but not destroyed completely. His decision to establish victim compensation funds using his personal wealth represented genuine atonement rather than strategic philanthropy, acknowledging responsibility for systems that he'd participated in without fully understanding their human cost. The foundation that bore David Donovan's name would provide educational scholarships and small business loans to families affected by predatory finance, creating opportunities that honored the memory of a man whose death had catalyzed justice for thousands of others. 6 months after Evangeline Frost's sentencing, the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago had become a symbol of corporate accountability that civic leaders used to demonstrate their commitment to environmental justice and economic fairness. The 25-year prison sentence that Evangeline received represented the longest term ever imposed for corporate environmental crimes. Federal judges finally willing to treat systematic pollution as the violent crime that it truly represented. The asset forfeiture provisions that accompanied her conviction had generated over $2 billion for victim compensation and environmental remediation, funding that would support community recovery efforts for decades while ensuring that criminal profits couldn't be enjoyed by their perpetrators or their families. Harper Donovan stood in the observation gallery as the final co-conspirators received their sentences, watching justice unfold with the satisfaction of someone who'd sacrificed personal comfort to achieve results that would benefit thousands of strangers. The courthouse proceedings felt surreal after months of clandestine investigation and dramatic confrontations, their formal proceedings creating official records of crimes that had seemed almost too sophisticated for traditional law enforcement to address. But federal prosecutors had proven equal to the challenge, building cases that would survive appellate review while establishing precedents that would deter future environmental crimes through certainty of punishment rather than merely theoretical liability. The Redstone Corporation that emerged from federal oversight bore little resemblance to the struggling company that Evangeline had targeted for acquisition and dismantling, its transformation representing everything that ethical corporate restructuring could achieve when properly implemented. Harper's original proposal had been refined through months of collaboration with management consultants, environmental engineers, and labor representatives who understood that sustainable profitability required stakeholder cooperation rather than adversarial relationships. The result was remarkable. A company that employed more workers than before the crisis, while generating higher profits through efficiency improvements that enhanced rather than replaced human capabilities. Alexander Cross's decision to serve as Redstone's interim CEO during its restructuring period represented personal atonement that impressed even his harshest critics, demonstrating commitment to ethical business practices that extended far beyond legal compliance requirements. His leadership style had evolved through the investigation process, developing collaborative approaches that contrasted sharply with the authoritarian methods that had built his empire. Employees throughout Cross Industries noticed the changes, reporting improved workplace culture and increased job satisfaction that translated into measurable productivity gains and reduced turnover rates. The manufacturing renaissance that spread throughout Pennsylvania's industrial communities exceeded even Harper's optimistic projections, creating a model for economic development that prioritized worker welfare alongside corporate profitability. The automation partnerships that she'd proposed had evolved into comprehensive workforce development programs that provided technical training and career advancement opportunities for employees whose skills had been undervalued by previous management approaches. The success of this model attracted national attention, generating interest from other struggling industrial regions that recognized the potential for similar transformations. Harvard Business School's invitation for Harper to complete her MBA studies came with full financial support and academic credit for the practical experience she'd gained during her investigation of corporate fraud, recognizing that real-world problem-solving often provided better education than classroom theoretical exercises. The dean's personal letter acknowledged that Harper's work represented the kind of applied business ethics that the school hoped to encourage among future leaders, combining analytical rigor with moral courage in ways that traditional academic programs struggled to develop. Harper accepted the offer with mixed emotions, understanding that formal credentials would enhance her credibility while worrying that academic environments might diminish the practical focus that made her effective. The consulting firm that Harper established, Heartland Industrial Solutions, operated from a renovated warehouse in Detroit's Eastern Market District, its location chosen to demonstrate commitment to the communities that her work was designed to serve. The office space reflected her values, functional rather than luxurious, accessible to working-class clients who might be intimidated by traditional corporate environments, and equipped with technology that enabled sophisticated analysis without unnecessary display of wealth or status. The firm's client base grew rapidly through word-of-mouth referrals from unions, community organizations, and municipal governments that appreciated Harper's combination of technical competence and genuine empathy for worker concerns. Alexander's role as Harper's first major client established a business relationship that benefited both parties while creating a model for ethical corporate consulting that other firms began emulating. Cross-industries contracts with Heartland Industrial Solutions included unusual provisions for community impact assessment and worker welfare monitoring, requirements that added complexity and cost to consulting engagements, while ensuring that recommendations would be implemented in ways that honored both fiduciary responsibilities and social obligations. The partnership generated positive media coverage that enhanced both organizations' reputations, while proving that ethical business practices could generate competitive advantages rather than merely impose additional costs. The environmental restoration projects that federal courts mandated as part of the conspiracy prosecutions created thousands of jobs in communities that had been systematically poisoned through decades of corporate negligence and regulatory capture. Harper's involvement in designing these programs ensured that cleanup efforts would provide long-term employment opportunities for residents whose health had been compromised by industrial pollution, creating economic development that addressed both environmental damage and community needs. The work was technically challenging and emotionally rewarding, providing Harper with professional satisfaction that purely theoretical business consulting couldn't match. Mitchell Langford's cooperation with federal investigators had earned him a reduced sentence, but his reputation in corporate America was permanently destroyed. His name associated with environmental crimes and financial fraud that made him unemployable in any legitimate business capacity. His testimony during Evangeline's trial had been compelling and comprehensive, providing inside details that proved essential for conviction while demonstrating the personal costs of participating in criminal conspiracies that seemed attractive until their consequences became clear. His current employment washing dishes in a prison kitchen represented justice that was both appropriate and educational for other executives who might consider similar choices. The federal investigation that began with Harper's research had expanded to encompass dozens of related cases throughout the financial services industry, creating a systematic examination of predatory practices that had been ignored or tolerated for decades. Grand juries in multiple districts were reviewing evidence of similar schemes, their investigations suggesting that Evangeline's network was merely one component of a much larger pattern of criminal activity that treated American communities as resources to be extracted rather than stakeholders to be served. The prosecutorial momentum generated by Harper's initial case promised to continue for years, creating accountability that previous enforcement efforts had failed to achieve. Claire Donovan's recovery from her kidnapping ordeal had been remarkably complete, her Alzheimer's condition actually improving slightly in response to the enhanced medical care that her daughter's success had made possible. The private nursing facility where Claire now resided specialized in innovative treatments for cognitive decline, its research programs offering hope that had been unavailable in the underfunded institutional environment where she'd previously lived. Harper's visits were more frequent and less stressful, the financial security provided by her consulting firm's success eliminating the constant worry about medical bills that had dominated their relationship for years. The David Donovan Foundation that Alexander had established to honor Harper's father provided scholarships and business development loans to families throughout industrial communities, its mission statement emphasizing the dignity of skilled labor and the importance of supporting workers who built America's prosperity through physical effort and technical expertise. The foundation's board included union leaders, community organizers, and small business owners who understood that economic development required grassroots participation rather than top-down planning. Harper served as an unpaid advisor, contributing strategic planning expertise, while ensuring that her father's memory was honored through practical assistance rather than symbolic gestures. The Mont Blanc pen that had fallen from Alexander's fingers during Harper's first interruption of their hotel meeting had become a symbol of transformation that both participants treasured for different reasons. Alexander had given it to Harper during their final collaboration on the Redstone restructuring, acknowledging that she'd earned the authority that such implements represented, while recognizing that true power came from knowledge and courage rather than expensive accessories. Harper carried it during important meetings and contract signings, its weight reminding her that influence carried responsibilities that extended far beyond personal success or financial gain. The Peninsula Hotel's penthouse suite, where their confrontation with Evangeline had begun, was now used for very different purposes, hosting meetings between community leaders and ethical investors who sought opportunities to rebuild American manufacturing through approaches that prioritize sustainability and worker welfare over short-term profit maximization. Harper returned there occasionally for client meetings, her presence in the suite representing a complete reversal of power relationships that had once seemed permanent and inevitable. The hotel staff who'd known her as a night shift worker now served her as an honored guest, their respectful treatment reflecting genuine admiration rather than mere professional courtesy. The final scene of Harper's transformation occurred during a meeting with Marcus Williams, a young entrepreneur from Detroit who'd developed innovative techniques for urban agriculture that could revitalize abandoned industrial sites while providing healthy food for communities that lacked access to fresh produce. His proposal combined environmental restoration with economic development in ways that reminded Harper of her own hybrid approach to corporate consulting, creating solutions that addressed multiple problems simultaneously rather than accepting trade-offs between competing interests. As she reviewed his business plan using the Mont Blanc pen that symbolized her journey from service worker to respected consultant, Harper reflected on how individual courage could create ripple effects that transformed entire systems of oppression into opportunities for justice. "True power isn't about who serves whom," Harper told Marcus as their meeting concluded, her words echoing thoughts that had sustained her through months of investigation and confrontation with forces that had seemed insurmountable. "It's about who chooses to serve their community." The phrase had become her personal motto and professional philosophy, guiding decisions that prioritized long-term community benefit over short-term personal gain. As she watched Marcus leave the hotel with renewed confidence and concrete next steps for his venture, Harper understood that her own success was meaningful only to the extent that it created opportunities for others to achieve similar transformations through their own courage and determination. The end. What started as one woman's interruption of a corporate deal became a movement that proved ordinary people could challenge extraordinary corruption when they combined intelligence with moral courage. Harper Donovan's story reminds us that the most dangerous person in any room is often the one everyone chooses to ignore, until they decide to speak truth to power. Share this story if you believe that individual actions can create systemic change. And remember, sometimes the most important conversations happen when we're brave enough to interrupt the status quo.